Well, Charlotte Ivers is our political correspondent and joins us now. Hello, Charlotte.
Good evening.
One of two Opposition Day debates was on this question of cladding after the Grenfell Tower disaster. And we know that a lot of Conservative MPs voiced their concerns that the government's not doing enough to people who are still trapped in blocks which may be dangerous.
They did indeed. A report recently put out by members of Parliament from the Housing Select Committee said that the £1.6 billion put into this by the government is not nearly enough to be able to get the problem solved. They estimated it would cost more like £15 billion. And there was a lot of pressure from MPs today, including on the Conservative side, speaking alongside the Labour MPs who put this forward, calling for this cost to fall on the developers who put the cladding there in the first place, rather than on leaseholders or on the taxpayer. More broadly, it does seem to be the case that the solving of this problem has been going fairly slowly. 58% of social housing with this cladding has had it removed, 30% of private sector housing. So there are still an awful lot of people in this country living in homes that have this cladding that we know is unsafe as part of their fabric.
Okay, Charlotte Ivers, our political correspondent, thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to be talking a bit more about that cladding issue in just a moment here on Times Radio.
Carole Walker on Times Radio.
Well, as we've just been discussing, the government's come under pressure from its own MPs today over the problems facing tens of thousands of leaseholders in blocks which have dangerous cladding. More than 3 years after the Grenfell Tower disaster in West London, in which 72 people died, many residents are still living in unsafe buildings and are unable to move or sell their properties. Well, opening the debate, the Shadow Housing Secretary Thangam Debonair laid out the problem.
Buying your first home is a life-defining moment. It's exciting and scary, and it symbolises security, time to start a family, build a future. But for so many, what was a dream come true has become a nightmare. The Grenfell tragedy shed light on a crisis of building safety in this country, and hundreds of buildings have the same cladding that caused the Grenfell fire to be so deadly. Thousands have other equally dangerous cladding. And even more have other serious fire safety problems, such as combustible insulation, missing fire breaks, faulty fire doors. Millions of homeowners are caught up in the wider building safety crisis caused by these defects, unable to sell or remortgage or buy a flat, freezing up to 16% of the housing market, affecting possibly as many as 11 million people. It can be easy to get caught up in the vast numbers, but it truly is a human tragedy.
Well, one of those affected is Tasha Letchford, who is an employment solicitor in Southampton, and she spoke to John Pienaar earlier.
There's millions of us stuck in unsafe homes. Personally, I was told that my one-bedroom flat in Southampton was covered in HPL cladding, which is not quite the same type as was on Grenfell, but similar, and Kingspan insulation, which has, from the Grenfell inquiry evidence, has come to light that it's unsafe and that the fire tests were fraudulently done on those materials. So we're sleeping in these buildings every day. So obviously, there just isn't enough action at the moment, and we're still facing this horror.
Well, the government has set aside £1.6 billion for removing dangerous cladding, but a recent report by MPs found the real costs are almost 10 times that figure. No Conservatives actually voted with Labour tonight, but several Tory backbenchers did say ministers must do more to help residents who are facing huge bills for the safety work. One of them is Bob Blackman, who is the Conservative MP for Harrow East and is a member of the Housing Select Committee, and joins us now. Hello, Bob.
Good evening, Carole.
Good evening. I'm very well, and thank you so much for joining us. Just tell us what your concerns are on this issue.
Well, the problem is this is a very complex issue, as you can probably tell from both the debate and the discussion that's gone on previously. In a nutshell, what we've got is a position whereby we've got ACM cladding. That's the type of cladding that was on the Grenfell block that very sadly resulted in the tragedy where so many people lost their lives, and has brought this to the attention of everyone. But as your previous individual said, it's not just the Grenfell type cladding, there's other forms of cladding. So we've got ACM cladding, that's the type that's on Grenfell. Then there's the non-ACM cladding, which is also unsafe. And then there are other types of cladding. We have a range of problems here. The first is that the testing regime, which I think the individual you interviewed earlier was talking about whether these tests were done fraudulently. Whether done fraudulently or not, I mean, the fact is the testing regime is not fit for purpose. If I can put it in a nutshell, basically, when you apply flames to cladding, often it will resist it, even if it's ACM cladding. The problem is that as soon as you cut holes in it for windows and doors, and you allow a gap between the cladding and the concrete, it acts almost like a chimney, and so therefore it's inherently unsafe. So we've got the problem with that to start with. The second is the building regulations under which this cladding was put on were set by the government, and a lot of us were asking for the building regulations to change a number of years ago because they weren't fit for purpose. So there's a defence for the developers and the building owners to say, well, look, we put this cladding up, and it conformed to the building regulations at the time. Now, that's a defence. Now, clearly, anyone that's put cladding up since Grenfell, I'm afraid, has no defence at all. So our other problem is that we have a lot of the building owners, not in the social rented sector. The social rented sector has done pretty well about getting rid of the ACM cladding, but in the privately owned blocks, there's very difficult to understand who owns these buildings. Often they're owned offshore, they may be managed by someone else. There's very complicated leases and other things. But I think what we are all clear on, and I think that the cross-party here, is that the leaseholders who bought a lease in good faith should not have to pay a penny towards the cost of putting these blocks back into a safe environment.
So if you've got these arguments going on, isn't there a case for the government just putting its hands in its pockets, paying for those repairs so that people can live in safety and in some cases perhaps at least be able to sell their properties and move out, get the work done, and then for the government to try and get the money back from the developers rather than it falling on the shoulders of those leaseholders?
Well, the consequence we've got at the moment is we've got flats that are unsaleable, unmortgageable, uninsurable, and unsafe. So, you've got the worst of all worlds here. And the innocent parties in this are the leaseholders, without question. They didn't put the blocks up in the first place. They didn't have to abide by building regulations. They didn't have to do anything. Our other problem is that we've got buildings that have been put up without proper safety measures and fire safety measures within them when they were put up. Obviously, the cladding is one issue, but it's not just the cladding, and that's what everyone needs to understand. So what our solution, and we put this forward on a cross-party basis, was that if we can't identify who the building owners are, and therefore the people that are responsible, then the government should take over those blocks, remediate the cladding, and then set the leaseholders up under what's called common hold. Now, that basically means that the leaseholders would then own the building. And it's grossly unfair for them to be expected to pay for the cost of remediation, but it's reasonable then for them, having had a building that's remediated, that then they take over ownership of it. Because otherwise, this whole terrible situation is going to continue on for many, many years.
And I mean, the government's been defending its action, but it hasn't got anywhere near as far as that sort of solution which you're proposing.
No, well, one of the problems is, to be fair I think we should be fair to the government here. The Secretary of State set aside £1.6 billion for the remediation of this cladding. And the first 600 million was spent on getting the socially rented accommodation up to speed, which has been done. The privately owned blocks, there's been a real problem in actually getting people to come forward with bids. And as the Minister set out today, one of the problems here is that people have done basic things. They haven't even put down the height of the buildings on their applications. So the government's got a problem here. What we do know is that it's going to cost a lot more money than the £1 billion they've set aside for this. Our estimate is 11 billion, and you arrive at this by a position of saying, before you do anything else, you have to survey the building. Now, the survey costs someone's got to pay for that. And that's a minimum of £10,000 before you even start thinking about how much work. We got examples this afternoon of blocks that are going to cost above £1 million each for the blocks to be remediated. And so the reality is that whatever the figure is, whether it's 5 billion, 11 billion, it's a much bigger sum.
And did you hear anything from, so we're just almost out of time because we should be going to the news.
Well, can I just say, the other consideration is whether the industry has got the capacity to do all this work, as well as at the same time as building new homes, which is what we want.
And just briefly, did you hear anything from the government during tonight's debate to suggest that they are prepared to do more, to dig deeper in Treasury pockets to try to resolve this?
Well, I think the main concern is that, as you mentioned, colleagues have put forward an amendment to the fire safety bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, that would make clear that leaseholders would not pay a penny. The government have a simple choice here. They either accept that amendment and get the bill on the statute books, or they propose their own amendment that delivers the same thing. Without that, the people who are the leaseholders are going to be waiting for the safety bill, building safety bill that's going through. And we did a pre-legislative scrutiny, and I can tell you we've recommended 40 changes to that bill just in our pre-legislative scrutiny. They're going to be waiting for at least 18 months to 2 years before they see any work done, and that's just unacceptable. So the government's got to move on this, and I hope we can reach a satisfactory compromise so that the leaseholders don't have to pay a penny, and it's outlawed in law. They do not have to pay a penny, and the building owners can't pass them on in service charges, because without that, the leaseholders are going to be the ones, unfortunately, because they're in situ, end up with these massive bills, and it's grossly unfair on them. They're the pure innocent party in all this.
Bob Blackman, Conservative MP for Harrow East, thank you so much for joining us and explaining that problem here on Times Radio. Obviously, much more to come on that. We will keep a close eye on that in the coming weeks